Pennsylvania Representative Summer Lee joined other advocates to talk about criminal justice reform during an event hosted by the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation.
Vice President, Center for Policy Analysis and Research, CBCF.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. So again, my name is Dr. Jonathan Cox, and I am the Vice President for our Center for Policy Analysis and Research at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. And I'm honored to welcome you all to another session at CBCF's 53rd Annual Legislative Conference. I love it. It's been many years. So each September, CBCF provides this important forum to explore challenges and opportunities that face Black Americans and the global Black community. As the largest public policy conference in the nation focusing on issues that are important to Black communities, ALC operates as a hub of Black innovation, thought, and most importantly, of action. Our conference theme, From Vision to Victory, Amplifying Black Voices, is a powerful and motivating call to action. The need to center and uplift voices of Black people remains necessary, not only for our people, but for all peoples. History has taught us that when Black Americans do well, all Americans do well, be it social and economic empowerment or upholding civil rights and the ideals of democracy themselves. This is even truer as we come close to ending this important election year. In order for our vision to become victory, we must amplify our collective Black voices. Now, in the Center for Policy Analysis and Research, we are deeply invested in our work towards the CBCF mission of informing policy and educating the public. We remain committed to improving the social, political, and economic circumstances of Black Americans by providing timely, relevant analysis and policy recommendations that really speak to issues that are important for Black communities. Now, this session today is a manifestation of this work and our commitment. Today, you're going to hear from thought leaders, change agents, community members, and practitioners, all who are at the forefront of their fields and who are actively engaged in on-the-ground work to shift policy, perspectives, and the structures that guide individual and organizational action. We are grateful for their contributions, their expertise, and their time, not only for today, but for their ongoing efforts on behalf of their and our communities. I also wanted to take this time to acknowledge two of our session partners, without whom we would not have been able to make this discussion possible: the American Institutes for Research Equity Initiative and Movement for Black Lives. Both of these organizations exemplify a deep commitment to issues of racial equity and the uplift of Black communities here in the United States and all over the world. We thank you both for your dedication and ongoing support and partnership. And now, it's my honor to introduce to you one of our session partners, Dr. Terrace Ross. Dr. Terrace Ross is Managing Director of the Equity Initiative at the American Institutes for Research. In this role, Dr. Ross works to refine the long-term substantive agenda of the Equity Initiative's work in education and its intersections with work, community, and health. She provides intellectual and technical leadership to improve educational and economic opportunity with deep appreciation for the challenges faced by communities segregated by race or place. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Terrace Ross to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Terrace Ross, Managing Director with the AIR Equity Initiative at the American Institutes for Research, or AIR. At AIR, our mission is to generate and use rigorous evidence that contributes to a better, more equitable world. Through the AIR Equity Initiative, we've been putting that mission into action, funding research, providing technical assistance, and building partnerships to address systemic inequities by race and place. Our work spans community health and wellness, public safety and policing, workforce development, and education in the U.S. and across the globe. This year marks the 70th anniversary of the Brown v. Board of Education ruling and the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. And as I reflect on these milestones and contemplate the title of today's session, One Step Forward and Three Steps Back, I'm really filled with a renewed sense of urgency to take actions that will serve not only to hold on to the hard-fought victories of the past, but to also deepen and advance equity for our present and our future. This is why I am excited to share that AIR is doubling its commitment to its mission and our work by investing $225 million over 10 years in efforts to ensure that no matter where you live or what you look like, you have an opportunity to thrive. In addition to this reinvestment, we are updating our identity to match. Beginning October 1st, the AIR Equity Initiative will be known as the AIR Opportunity Fund. This change is not just cosmetic, it represents an expansion of our approach to tackling systemic inequities. We've learned over the years that the most effective solutions come from deep engagement with the communities we serve and stand on the value, nothing for us without us. So the AIR Opportunity Fund will employ a place-based funding approach, enabling local communities with the assistance of researchers and technical assistance providers to craft solutions to advance equity in ways that are tailored to their own unique needs and strengths. This approach will drive innovative, community-centered, and research-informed solutions that are relevant and sustainable. We are often asked, how will you measure success? Well, for us, success isn't just about numbers or reports. It's about the real-world impact we will have on the communities that we support. We're committed to not only driving change, but also learning from our experiences and sharing those learnings with policymakers, researchers, and the public to improve, when appropriate, scale effective strategies. But we can't do this alone. We are not just funders. We are partners, and we invite you to join us in this effort to create lasting, meaningful change. The AIR Opportunity Fund represents a bold step forward in our mission to promote equity. Our name may have changed, but our commitment remains as strong as ever. We are excited to embark on this new chapter, fueled by the clear urgency of the moment and bolstered by the examples of success that have paved the way. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Amara Enya, who is the new interim co-executive at the Movement for Black Lives. Thank you, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Enya.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be in this space with all of you today at this Congressional Black Caucus Annual Legislative Conference. We are excited about the discussions that we've been able to have so far, and especially excited about the important conversation we're going to have in this session. Before we dive in, I want to thank the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation for the partnership and for the collaboration. This is something that we have been cultivating over the last year, and it really speaks to a commitment to how we work, to whom we work with, and to the kind of impact that we want to have for our people. And so for that, I want to thank Jonathan. I want to thank the President and CEO, Nicole Austin Hillary, and to the entire CBCF team. I also want to thank our partners for this session, AIR, who is going to be helping us to hold this conversation. And because we are here not representing ourselves, we are representing our ancestors, it feels very important that we acknowledge our ancestors in this space, because they have paved the way for us to continue to do this work, to build on their legacy, and those are the shoulders upon which we stand. Additionally, we are not here just in our own capacity because we like to talk about policy. We represent millions of our people, not just in the United States, but around the world, who are building power, who are lifting their voices, who are connecting, who are collaborating. And so we have a privilege of being in this space, but we always keep our people in the back of our minds, particularly those who are not able to be in this room today. So with that, again, my name is Amara Enya, and I'm the interim co-executive at the Movement for Black Lives. We are an ecosystem of 200 organizations across the country. For those of you who can recall a world-changing series of events in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, namely the murder of Mike Brown, the Movement for Black Lives was formed in the wake of that and the uprisings that followed. In December 2014, the organization was created as a space for Black organizations across the country to debate and discuss the current political conditions, to develop shared assessments of what political interventions are necessary in order to achieve key policy, cultural, and political wins, to convene organizational leadership in order to debate and co-create a shared movement-wide strategy under the fundamental idea that we can achieve more together than we can separately. We're organizers. We believe in policy, but we also believe in being out in the streets. We believe in talking in the corridors of power, but we believe more in talking to our people. And those conversations are what inform and what drive our work. So for the purposes of this discussion, we recently published a report called Perspectives on Community Safety that actually talks to our people about what safety means to us and what it requires. We engaged on numerous narratives over the last several years that have predominated when it comes to issues of safety, and we really came to a deeper understanding that our communities are defining safety for themselves, and we have key interventions that are actually being created and enacted across the country. And we see our responsibility in amplifying those interventions and sharing them for the purposes of scaling up. And so we have the privilege of having with us our panelists who will be talking more about not just our report that we released, but diving into some of the challenging questions around public safety and what it means to take a step forward and then 3 steps back, and what these fights look like and what they require. In order to help steer the conversation, I have the privilege of introducing Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. I had to lead with that. It's very important. Wesley Lowery. So Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, author, and contributing editor at the Marshall Project. He is a visiting professional at CUNY Graduate School of Journalism, an executive editor of the Investigative Reporting Workshop at American University. Lowery was previously a national correspondent at the Washington Post, specializing in issues of race and law enforcement. He led the team awarded the Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting in 2016 for the creation and analysis of a real-time database to track fatal police shootings. His project, called Murder with Impunity, is an unprecedented look at unsolved homicides in major American cities. And again, just to put a button on that, he's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. So we appreciate you, want to welcome you to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to have her introduce me everywhere I go from now on. So we have great panelists for a great conversation, and I'm excited to welcome them up. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by reading bios, and as I begin to introduce you guys, if you want to know bios, I'm getting vetoed. Oh, I heard you. I mean, look, I don't know the bios either, but... So we'll start there with Representative Summer Lee. a dedicated organizer, attorney, progressive state legislator, and in 2018 made history becoming the first black woman from Western Pennsylvania ever elected to the state legislature after defeating a 20-year incumbent. She's been a voice for working families and a champion for environmental justice, police accountability, reproductive rights, and a lot of other good things. See, I could triage a little bit, right? I got you. Next up, we have Rayshawn Ray. Rayshawn is the Vice President, Executive Director of AIR Equity Initiative at the American Institutes for Research. Launched in 2021, the AIR Equity Initiative is a 10-year, $225 million investment in behavioral and social science research and technical assistance to address the underlying causes of our systemic inequalities, plus a lot of other cool stuff about where he's written and where he's published. And now we have Moniva Bandele. She is on the leadership team for the Movement for Black Lives, representing the Malcolm X grassroots movement. M4BL is an ecosystem of over 200 black-led organizations that emerged in the wake of the Ferguson uprisings and the demonstrations and protests we saw all around the country. She's been a contributing writer to M4BL's Vision for Black Lives and is a member of the steering committee for the New York-based coalition, Communities United for Police Reform. I'm going to hop down and hang out with them. And Paul Butler. I don't want to forget my buddy Paul Butler. Sorry about that, Paul. Paul Butler is the Albert Brick Professor in Law at Georgetown University, a legal analyst on MSNBC, a contributing opinion writer for the Washington Post, and host of the PBS series Returning Citizens: Life Beyond Incarceration. Professor Butler is an expert on these issues and one of the most consulted and listened to voices when it comes to conversations about mass incarceration and our criminal legal system. And so we have a remarkably talented panel. I'm going to go sit down with them, and we're going to go ahead and get started. Now, just so you all know, this is one of the more robust, longer conversations we have. That's why we got food, in case you didn't already grab some. But after I get through my questions, we're going to have some time at the end for you all to ask questions as well. And so make sure that you guys come up with them, or else I'm going to have to do it like I do my college students and start calling on people. And that's not going to go too well. We're all too old for that, right? So make sure any questions you have about our conversation or for our panelists, you start getting them prepared as well, because there'll be an opportunity for you all in a second. And so give me 42 seconds to walk down there, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you guys for being here. Okay. Am I on? There we go. All right. Well, perfect. Thank you guys so much for joining this panel today and being here for this important discussion. It's remarkable to think about. We sit here in the year 2024, which means we are a decade removed from the demonstrations, the protests, the uprising in Ferguson, Missouri, 12 years removed from Trayvon Martin and Jordan Davis and Troy Davis. And we think about all of the names and locations we have learned of and thought of in the years since then. We think of all of those moments of protest, of demonstrations, of grief, of agony. And of course, our mind comes to 4 years ago. 4 years ago was the last time we were in a presidential cycle. And that spring, we saw massive demonstrations following the deaths of Christian Cooper, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, the incident with Ahmaud Arbery in New York City. And we saw many cities and states across the country implement a variety of justice reforms or pledge or promise that they were going to do something, that this was going to be a moment where change was going to happen and it was going to come in some real way. We saw limits on chokeholds and no-knock warrants. We saw some federal action. But since then, as we talk to folks who work on the ground on these issues or follow them closely, I think many would note that much less came than perhaps was promised or pledged. And in some cases, we've in fact seen rollbacks to steps that were taken. Does that come as a surprise to you? And also, how would you all assess where we are 4 years post-George Floyd, post-Breonna Taylor, post everyone kneeling in the kente cloths, and now as we have another presidential cycle in which voters are going to be asked to show up and cast ballots on behalf of many of the same lawmakers who were around 4 years ago. And we can popcorn around. I'm not going to call on you all. Well, I'm going to call on you guys later, but I'm not going to call on you all. And I think you all have mics to your right, sir. Congresswoman.
Let me make sure. Okay, I believe I'm on. Thank you for. I'm grateful to be here. Grateful to be a part of this conversation. And I think that it is one of the things that I just know. Listen, I can just look around this room and I know and I can see how disappointed people are. We all lived through this and we all participated in it. Everybody in some way participated at that time. And I want to remark upon that because there is no small way of participating, right? We all figured out what was the best way that we can contribute, where our voices could be, and folks did it. Folks came out to the ballot box, they voted, they came out and they protested, they came out and they flipped legislatures. And yes, we're here, and if I had to give my assessment of where we are, I think that we are where we've always been, in some ways. I think that we are where we always have been in some ways because, as we know, power concedes nothing without a demand, and your demand has to be mighty. It does. And we are in a process of figuring out as a movement, right? I think that we have a unique synergy that we have not always had. We're recognizing as a movement that we actually need every single piece of the puzzle as tools. Each one is a tool, right? So our protest is one of the tools, right? Movement spaces, our movement, our organizing, our activism, that's an important tool. Your electoral work is actually an important tool that goes hand in hand with that, right? So as we are building movements, social justice movements, and we're building them around electoral movements at the same time, is where we're actually starting to put dents in. And we recognize that these things are not built overnight. They won't be dismantled overnight, but we do have a responsibility of creating metrics that people can actually follow, because folks will get hopeless if it looks like, well, we came out and we did what we did. I didn't ask you to put on kente cloth. I asked my legislator to do that. So they want to see that we're making these movements, but they also need to understand that these places are historically slow moving. So I think that when I think about the barriers that we have and what is really actually standing, why we are not further along, I think it's because these institutions don't want to be further along. And I think about this, and I say that very intentionally, even here in this space, that to survive even as a black legislature is to recognize or to accept some limitations. So I think that as a movement, we have to untether ourselves from so many of the expectations of these institutions. We have to make demands that are more clear, but also that are stronger. Because sometimes what happens, and we were having this conversation at the beginning of this, that sometimes we'll ask for something and we'll get the yes really quickly, and we don't hesitate to wonder why they said yes so fast. Right? If they're not squirming from our ass, we're talking about deep institutional systemic racism, and if they're saying yes super fast, then we obviously didn't ask for quite enough. So I think we have to get comfortable in the discomfort of other people, comfortable with the discomfort of people who actually do will power over us. Because as long as we are letting them off the hook, as long as we're maybe just sitting there and we'll accept the DEI training, we'll accept this, but not actually keeping our foot on necks, we have to do that, and that's not easy. That's why my panel was about money and politics. It's why we're seeing people who are talking about the cyclical nature of these things, because we can't get to police violence without first getting into how do we get a reflective democracy that actually looks like the people in this room, not looks like us, but thinks like us, cares about what we want, and are going to prioritize the things that we want. And there are many barriers to that we have to talk about even before we can get to the police violence, to the accountability, to the criminal legal reform, because we can't have those things if we are not having the right people in the right positions first. And the reality is that we never actually have.
That's right. I don't know, is it on? Oh, it is on. Yeah, I mean, two things to that. And I'm so glad that Congresswoman Lee spoke first, because yes, we're disappointed in where we are right now, right? That we were demanding transformational change. We were building power, and we still are. But let's not be gaslit by corporate media, okay? I believe we took 3 steps forward and took 3 more steps forward. And part of the reason why the backlash is being so amplified is because of the power of our demand. And because if it wasn't for how powerful our work was, how powerful our base building was, we wouldn't have amazing champions right now here today like Congresswoman Lee. We were able to not only expand the Congressional Black Caucus in these last 2 cycles, but we were able to put in place black progressives that understood what our people were talking about in the streets and in communities and are willing to stand on business to make demands that many people find very uncomfortable. That's called winning. So both things can be true. Yes, bail reform, we fought hard for that in New York State. It hurts our heart every year where they pick apart little pieces of it, creating false narratives about an increase in crime being connected to bail reform. Yes, we get upset when the narratives that we put out there are attacked in the media, and they're used when people are running for governor, even in blue states like New York, right, using the advances that we've done, right, to elect far right-wing people for governor, and having folks having their own party echoing this same harmful messaging that the reform that we fought for is somehow making our communities less safe. And what we've always said from the beginning is that we want more safety than the police could ever provide. Our people deserve real safety. They deserve to be safe from everything, inside the house, outside the house, in the school, in the supermarket, everywhere. And when we demand infrastructure and when we demand innovations that create that type of safety, it disrupts power. It disrupts the people in power. So we see a backlash. And it's not because of our messaging. Don't let anybody tell you that the backlash is because we were saying defund the police. That's a lot of bullshit. That's like saying the attack on critical race theory is because of the words they chose. That's like saying the attack on, remember when people didn't like Black Lives Matter before there was a boulevard named after in every city? You should say all lives matter, right? It's BS. Would you think black history is marketed poorly and that's why it's being taken out of schools? Stop being gaslit. It's because these demands challenge power at the very core. They are transformational. And when we say that safe communities come from a public health intervention, that sounds great to us, but we have to understand that there's billions of dollars invested in policing and prisons. We are attacking the pockets, the purses, the purse strings of very, very powerful people and institutions. Rikers Island does not make me more safe in my community. More people die on Rikers Island than in the park, where the park up from me, a lot of people die there too, right? So it is not a safe place. It does not promote safety. And when we start to raise these questions with our community, and I'll pass it after this, but I think it's really important because Amara talked about a recent report that we did. When you interview black people on community safety, 67% said they wanted to see investments in public health solutions to community safety and to mental health crisis than to police. That's a conversation, that's a statistic we could not say 4 years ago, and it's a conversation that wasn't even had 10 years ago. So our movement is powerful. We not only have people in Congress, we got a federal bill in Congress with 37 co-sponsors. Not only did we put abolitionist-leaning mayors and county executives all over the country, but we have 18 cities where grassroots organizations are fighting to shift the city budget away from police departments and into alternative first responders for mental health crisis. That's not something that the losing team does.
Well, that's the end of the panel. We got it. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm a legal analyst on MSNBC, and I do a lot of talking on the network about January 6, 2020. I much prefer to talk about June 6, 2020. The New York Times did an article that said June 6, 2020 was the day that made the movement for Black Lives the largest social justice movement in the history of the United States. On June 6, 2020, there were demonstrations protesting the murder of George Floyd in 550 different cities all around the country. And so the question is, what happened to that energy? What happened to that movement? And I agree with my co-panelists that there's a lot more to be excited about and enthused about and inspired by than there is to be pessimistic and disappointed by. So before the summer of 2020, no one had heard the phrase defund the police. It came up in the protests. And there's been a lot of critique about the messaging of that phrase. I've been doing this work for a long time. The first time, again, anyone heard that phrase was June 2020. In August 2020, all around the country, jurisdictions started defunding the police. Now, some of it was on paper, moving some money from one budget to another, but some of it was real, taking money out of resources that went to locking folks up and putting those resources into lifting them up, public health, other kinds of initiatives. And a lot of that happened at the state level. And it's crucial to understand that 90% of criminal cases occur at the state level. You've heard the expression, it's not a federal case. Only about 10% of cases are federal. So while it's a tragedy that the George Floyd Justice and Policing Bill hasn't been passed by this Congress, there's a lot to look at on the state level that is going on, and that while some of those measures have been cut back on, most have not. So again, that's the product of this beautiful struggle, of this movement, and that's something that we should all be very proud of. What happened really quickly? I think a couple things. One is politics, and the other is the real world of crime. So in 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, there was this moment where for a lot of elected officials, the right thing to do, as well as the politically expedient thing to do, was to support reform, and especially police reform. Not all of that was sincere. Not all of that was well thought out. So to use my own city as an example, in May 2020, we had the mayor of the District of Columbia order the words Black Lives Matter put in large print in a plaza across the street from the White House, so that when then President Trump looked out, he'd have to look out and see those words. Fast forward about a year, 2 years later, the mayor, the same mayor who put up the Black Lives Matter inscription, she vetoes a crime bill that reduces sentences. But it's a crime bill that reduces sentences understanding the politics of crime. So one example is that the punishment for carjacking was changed from 40 years to 30 years. Make no mistake, 30 years is a long time to be in prison. And as a matter of fact, no one who carjacked in D.C. was even being sentenced to 30 years, much less 40 years, which was the statutory maximum. The mayor vetoed that bill because she said she thought it sent the wrong message at a time when crime was going up, or carjacking in D.C. was going up. She said to reduce the punishment from 40 years to just 30 years sent the wrong message. So that was political, and again, it makes me question the sincerity of whether Black Lives Matter painted on the town square translates to actual movement. And the other thing really quickly that happened is crime started happening, right? And crime is annoying. It makes us angry at people who cause harm or inconvenience us. So my colleague at MSNBC, a man of whom I have the most respect, Reverend Sharpton, says on television, it's extremely annoying to go into CVS and have everything behind glass and you have to push a button and wait for somebody to come and open it, an employee. And Reverend Sharpton says he understands that there's an issue with sending every shoplifter to jail. But at the same time, this situation he describes as intolerable. Reality is that we're not going to have sentencing reform. We're not going to reduce mass incarceration. We're not going to change the new Jim Crow unless we show a certain level of solicitude and mercy to people who are actual criminals, including people who are shoplifters, including people who have caused harm. There's this idea that most people are locked up in the United States for nonviolent drug crimes. That's not true. If nobody was locked up for any drug crime, we'd still incarcerate more people than any country in the world. That's because most of the people who are in state prisons are there for violent offenses. And the only way we reduce mass incarceration, get rid of the old Jim Crow, is to express solicitude, including for people who caused harm. That's really difficult for politicians.
Okay, so this has been great. I'm going to try to play cleanup pretty quickly because I think some statistics are really important to layer what I'm hearing from my panelists. So before my role at the American Institutes for Research, I've researched policing in America for over 15 years. As a professor of sociology at the University of Maryland and a senior fellow at Brookings. And it's a few things that I know. Depending on which level we're talking about, the local, state, or federal level, I think really dictates how we think about change. As we look across the United States, there's one very, very important indicator that all of us are talking about and in some ways talking around that hasn't changed, and that's the number of people who are killed in America by police, and in particularly the number of people who are killed in police in America that look like most of us who are sitting in this room. Every year in the United States, over 1,000 people are killed by police officers. That is a person every 8 hours. Roughly every 40 hours in America, an African American is killed by police. And so it becomes important to think about that. And as many people as we know that have a hashtag, there are so many others who don't. So I think it's important to necessarily layer that way. The other thing that my research has documented is the illness spillovers of police violence. What does that mean? That if you live in a neighborhood where police violence is higher, irregardless of whether or not your neighborhood has crime or not, I'll get to that in a second, but irregardless of that, your health actually suffers. Your mental and physical health literally deteriorates. Black women's physical health gets worse. Hypertension, higher likelihood of stroke and high blood pressure. Also a higher likelihood of obesity. For black men, black men's mental health suffers. They have a higher rate of anxiety, a higher rate of depression. So the illness spillovers of police violence, the fact that we are continuously processing mental minutes, thinking about whether or not we've been discriminated against, thinking about what happens when your son or your father or your loved one goes out of the house, that is a level of stress that impacts us. I think the other thing that becomes important is to understand who's actually being killed. See, one thing that they would have us to believe is that black people and people in general, regardless if they're black or not, that are killed by police are oftentimes doing something that's violent or dangerous or criminal. And that's actually not the case either. In fact, research documents that there is not a significant correlation between police killings and violent crime. In other words, we will make the assumption that in places where violent crime is higher, that police killings will be higher, right? We might make that assumption. In other words, people are doing things badly, police then respond and do something. That's actually not the case at all. Those two metrics are not correlated at all statistically. Now, both of them are really important. We need to address violent crime on one hand, and we need to address policing on the other hand. But they are not connected. So the key statistic of all the ones that I've laid out, one of the ones that I want you to take away from today, is that black people are 3.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by police when they are not attacking and when they are unarmed. Let me repeat that. Black people are 3.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by police when they are unarmed and not attacking. Who say that? Police officers themselves with FBI data that I've analyzed and working with the FBI to actually analyze these data. So that becomes important to kind of lay out. So why haven't things changed for that metric as much as we would think? Well, there's always been racial retrenchment. Whenever progress is made, whenever we're moving, there's always a backpedaler. And on one hand, there has been a lot of movement, as people have said, locally and at the state level. Now, at the federal level, and many of us have worked on the Floyd Justice and Policing Act. I know I was meeting with Senator Cory Booker and Congresswoman Karen Bass and others about this, and that was disheartening. I mean, that was very, very difficult to take on and kind of think about. And the other thing that I know, particularly serving on post committees, that's peace officers, standards and trainings commissions for each state that actually regulates the rules and laws that police officers follow, I do think there's some low-hanging fruit there. And one of the big ones is how we select police officers to begin with. What is the threshold that leads to us selecting them? And in California and the state of Maryland, where I've served, we've actually got that changed. The other thing is certification around what leads to police officers staying in there. In the state of Texas, I worked on a wandering officer law. One of the big things that people don't realize, if we talk about Tamir Rice, if we talk about more recently with Sonia Massey in Illinois, is that both of them were killed by officers who should never have been police officers in the first place. They had actually been let go from departments before that. Why are they still being hired, right? And of course, we can think about several others where that's the case. When we think about implicit bias trainings, are they important? Yeah, with Black Onyx Management and others, they have these really important training programs, and if you implement them right over a series of days, they really work. The thing that I know, developing a virtual reality training program at the University of Maryland with Google, to implement in police departments, is that they only go so far. And the reason why they only go so far is because police officers have a very low accountability to the public. They have very high internal accountability. So let me repeat that. Police officers, law enforcement has very low external accountability, meaning to us in this room, and very high accountability to other police officers internally. This is the reason why if they cuss during roll call or they wreck their car, they get in a lot of trouble. But they could hurt your kid, and all of a sudden, nothing is going to happen. I mean, as we heard from Professor Butler and others, the likelihood of them being charged and even convicted is extremely low. 99% of the time, nothing ever happens. But let me tell you what does actually work. What actually does work is not only the certification and getting data, but the big one is centered around police insurance. Let me walk y'all through this quickly. What we need, think about it. If you're a plumber, if you're an electrician, if you're something like that, somebody comes into your house to do something, they have insurance. Law enforcement does not. They can hurt you and hurt someone else, and it means nothing. And how much money are we talking about? When we're talking about billions of dollars, that's exactly what we're talking about. From 2015 to 2019, over $2 billion of your tax money was paid out in civilian settlements for police misconduct nationally. $2 billion. Imagine if that money was going to our communities to deal with education, to deal with workforce development, to deal with health care, to deal with all the things that we know that matters. But instead, your money is being paid for a police officer who has done something to someone in your community that you might know. $2 billion. Instead, what would change it? What would change it is to change the accountability structure. Imagine if police officers had just a little bit of liability insurance. The state of Colorado has done this. So if you're looking to replicate this in your state, they've implemented a police insurance model where $25,000 of liability insurance police officers are liable for. But we have to go beyond that because they're just going to kick the bucket to police officers, many of whom are really trying hard to do their jobs every single day, and we don't talk enough about them, right? But on the other hand of this, it is the actual organizational structure of policing, oftentimes that operates through the Fraternal Order of Police. So what we need are police department liability insurance so that the money is not coming from your state budget, where in cities like in Chicago, they actually budget for police liability or police civil settlements up to, say, $20 million. They didn't have enough money to pay that. So you know what they did? They ended up creating bonds on the open market that people could purchase like it's on the stock that you are paying if you are in Chicago because they don't have enough money to pay it. So in the grand scheme, if we actually want to do something about it to get us far downfield, we need liability insurance, not only for individual officers, but also for the police departments.
Thank you. Can I just say one point while just stay on this for 1 second, because I really want to be clear also about the experiences and expertise of those 200 organizations in the Movement for Black Lives. How many people out there are organizers on the ground in your community? I want to say that our grassroots organizers, we are also researchers, we are also litigators, we also write policy, we also create narrative power plans. And what we found, not just over the last 10 years, but many of us that have been doing this work for 20 years, is that it's not that we need better police, It's not that we need more trained police. It's not even that we need more mechanisms within policing in general, right, that make police accountable to communities. We do need that, but we need less policing. And so I just wanted to underscore that point that we're putting out in our report and in the Vision for Black Lives, is that we're actually saying that Olivia Benson is not at the local precinct. And that we've been fed a narrative.
Don't come for Benson and
power.
Stabler, though. Careful.
She is not coming to save you, right? But if you had stable housing, if your park was well lit, right? If you were able to get to and from school in a way that was efficient and affordable for your parents, right? You know, we can go down, if you had access to food on a regular basis, if you had access to mental health care, if you had, you know, access to job training, we could create a whole list of the social determinants of safety that wouldn't even make it necessary for you to have the fake 200 Olivia Bensons that I have at my local precinct. So I want to say yes and to our colleagues. I think it's really important. But also, yes, and we have to change how we look at people who commit crimes of poverty. But we also have to change how we look at police. And we are up against 6 decades of a multi-million-dollar narrative campaign, propaganda, that has us thinking that that is the only pathway to safety. And it's not.
I'm really glad you jumped in there, because I want to stay at the local and state level for a second, and so I'm ask one more there, and then I want to go back up to federal for a moment. But I wanted to frame this next question based around this very idea of narrative, how we think about, how we talk about so much of this in the public sphere. And all of us any of us who have any experience working in any amount of policy or understand that very often the political narrative is going to be divorced from the reality on the ground or the reality of policy. And so it was noted earlier, but there was movement, M4BL and Gen Forward put out a poll, I want to say earlier this year, fresh polling around this question. And it was referenced earlier, but I want to read some of it back into the record as well. That 67% of black Americans who were polled supported reallocating part of police budgets towards investment in healthcare, education, housing, and other areas, while 55% supported divestment from police departments and allocating entire police budgets towards such investments. Right now, that's polling of black Americans, and so communities that are the closest or the most relevant when we're having this conversation specifically in a black context, right? So what we see now is that majorities of black Americans support some type of significant divestment and reinvestment, even at a time where we know that calls for more abolitionist frameworks, divestments, defunding are used as a political cudgel against progressive movements and Democratic candidates. But separate of the narrative conversation, right, if we accept as a premise that majorities of the people in the communities most impacted by violence and most impacted by policing support some type of significant reinvestment, divestment as it relates to our public safety spending, what types of programs are we seeing that are being effective? Are there places that have been applying these types of frameworks and these types of programs? That one of the things that happens is, and this was alluded to early on, I think the Congresswoman noted this, right, that very often there are a lot of people who say a lot of yeses really quickly post George Floyd. Sure, we'll do this. Sure. People are trying to grab whatever they can off the shelf because it's important to show that you're willing to do something. And that doesn't necessarily mean they'll do everything that folks request, but what that does mean is you look up 4 years later and a lot of pilot programs have piloted. What is it we've learned, what is it we have seen, once we get out of the political food fight of should we divest, should we defund, should we not? There are places that are attempting to do this work. What should we know today, and what do we know today that we didn't know 4 years ago?
Yeah, so I think it's a few things. So, and a lot of us have written extensively on this and researched it, but it's a few things to know about defund the police, which is simply reallocating funding. The first big thing is it's centered around a few things. First, it's centered around response times. The thing that many of you all know that we don't always explicitly say is that if you live in a black or brown neighborhood, response times are slower. Not just for police when something's wrong, but from the ambulatory services when you need them to come because your grandfather or your grandmother had a stroke. And we know that people are dying. So the response times are slower, okay? So that means for the dollars that we're contributing in taxes, we're getting less back from that. All right, just follow this thing real quickly. Second is clearance rates. Clearance rates means how successful are police at arresting someone for a crime. Right, raise your hand if you think when it comes to murder that they are over 50% successful. Like that they arrest someone every 1 out of 2 times. What about 25%? Few people. What about robbery? Do you think, how successful are police at arresting someone for a robbery? Raise your hand if you think it's 50%, at least 50%. Okay, yeah, y'all, what, 25%? Y'all think that 1 out of 4 is successful? All right, some of y'all like, I don't know which way it is, but so yeah, it's less than 50% for all of these indicators. So that is one of the reasons why people oftentimes feel less safe, because you watch the news and then you're like, dang, they didn't even catch anybody. Right? Why don't they catch people? It's not necessarily because the police aren't good at their jobs. It's because they are doing a host of other things, such as looking for potholes. You need to look in your city if it's police jobs to go around and look for potholes. I don't know about you, but I went to college in Memphis. I live in the D.C. area. Somebody need to be looking at potholes. But I don't necessarily think police should be doing that, right? And so they don't always have the opportunity to do those things because they are focused so much on discrete tasks that don't necessarily help them investigate and solve crimes that would make us feel more safe. The other thing is, what percentage of the police budget do you actually think we're getting for these services? In cities like Chicago, Oakland, Minneapolis, I can name several others, over 30% of the city budget is going to public safety, which is mostly police. You got to ask yourself, for every $1 out of $3 that you contribute in taxes, are you getting that back when they're not responding as quickly, when they might be profiling your grandchild going home from school? So the budgets end up increasing because when you sit in these city budgets, the city needs someone to respond to a series of things. And the police will say, we'll do it. And then it ends up ballooning what's happening. When we talk about reallocation, there are some places where we've seen that. Baltimore, for example, a few years ago, reallocated about $15 to $20 million for social services, particularly related to education. In LA, they actually consolidated services where they reallocated funding because the sheriff's department and the police department had overlapping responsibilities. There are other examples I could provide. The whole point is it's not about using the term defund the police because oftentimes people are for reallocation. It's about looking at the budget and looking at it. So my overall point is follow the money. And when you actually follow the money, you start figuring out ways how to carve off things. Because when we're talking about social services, oftentimes less than 5% of city budgets go to social services. Things that we think they really matter a lot, less than 5%. And in a lot of cities, over 30% is going to police. I don't know about you, but those percentages are all out of whack. And so we need to look at the money and we can start to shave off different forms of money to ensure that reallocations and reappropriations don't continue to go to policing when people oftentimes want less policing.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a great question. There are interesting places where there's some experiments happening in Austin, Texas, and Denver, Colorado, but I kind of want to complicate our thinking around that question and demand more. We actually know what safe communities look like because there are safe communities in the United States, right? And we know that what those communities have are not more police. In fact, even in New York, when you go to the safest communities in New York, you hardly see any police. But I'll tell you what you do see. You see stable housing. You see people have the access to the best education that money can buy. You see that people are in their homes and that they're not separated by people being incarcerated or deported or otherwise unable to be with their families. You see light, you see grocery stores, you see a plethora of meal options that are healthy, okay? And the list goes on and on and on. So I think that's actually our innovation. That's our experiment. I want you to bring the resources in Westchester down to the Bronx, And then you will see how you need less police. Right there, it's that simple. You can look at, people are doing these alternative first responders, and they are amazing experiments, but it's almost like we're overcomplicating it, right? We're overcomplicating it. The safest communities in the country do not have the most police, they have the most resources. That's why we said defund the police, because we want the resources.
That is my go-to answer. In fact, I love that you said that, because I think I have used that phrase literally verbatim, and that's called message discipline, because that's message discipline. And no, because people are always so shocked when we say it, like it's a profound revelation. There are communities that we have all driven through that we all see. So I want to come back to that when it comes to my colleagues, when it comes to state houses, from local up to federal. Then what is the holdup, right? Why are we having such a hard time actually getting to the root of this? And that's because now we're talking about money. We're talking about going much, much deeper than any of the individual policies, pieces of legislation that we can write. And those pieces of legislation are incredibly important. But when we talk about the real demand, when we talk about the real demand behind what we are funding in our communities, is that we're actually asking our government to fundamentally shift the way that it governs, to fundamentally shift and reallocate and redistribute wealth, to redistribute opportunity, to redistribute access. And we're talking about the ways in which our schools are funded, the ways in which communities are built. Or why are black and brown communities more likely to live next to that environmental hazard? But we know now through experience that those people who grew up by those environmental hazards, who were once children with asthma, grow up to be adults who encounter police. We recognize that disability is also a poverty issue, and it's also an issue about access to health care, access to healthy and clean water and clean air. But that then exposes those children to the carceral system later on in life. So we're asking our government to not do this issue piecemeal. We're talking about how poverty, how racism, how inequality are all cyclical. And if we have people in government who refuse to see it as cyclical, then we can't actually even get to the root of it. When I first ran, I grew up in a community that has the environmental hazard right by it. We know that black and brown people and poor people are more likely to live by that environmental hazard. But we know they're there because they were redlined in those communities. There was government action that led to us living in these communities. We know that in those very communities, those schools are less likely to be invested in appropriately. In the wealthiest country on earth, your zip code determines the quality of your education. We know that those schools, we know that there are no job centers in those very communities. And we also know what the state of our infrastructure is. There are a few public transportation ways to get in and out of those communities too. Those also what we're actually doing is we're buying these communities a one-way ticket right back into that cycle, generation after generation after generation. And what we actually need from our government is to talk about how are we going to make sure that we are taking resources from folks who are accustomed to always having it, which are also the same people who are accustomed to being centered politically. They are often centered politically, and saying that we need to shift to a center politically. We need to shift it to the most marginalized. We need to shift it to the folks who have been starved of the most resources. And that is a much bigger load. And that's why we're seeing millions upon millions of dollars to come in to shape our politics. Millions upon millions of dollars to determine whose experiences should be in the halls of Congress and power. When we're talking about even pieces of legislation, even the best legislation we have sometimes always and often falls short, because it's always and often missing key perspectives from people who actually have those lived experiences. We're getting to their pocketbooks. We're asking our government to say that you can actually afford to create opportunity for black people in this country. You can't afford to educate black students. You can't afford to feed black children. You can't afford to treat sick black people. And they're saying that they don't want to do that. So when we talk about policing, it's easier to invest in that. And then it then cycles back into the political question, the political fear-mongering, the political narratives that are creating. We can keep black folks thinking about the same thing that we're thinking about, because as soon as we get close to it, and we often do, Black Lives Matter movement was black folks, brown folks, and allies all starting to get to the point of what was actually happening here. And then you have to see Republicans and conservatives going double hard on the fear-mongering, double hard on, well, you know what, if you don't have police, your grandma's going to get mugged. I want to go back to that because that point about 60% of black folks just wanting our money to go into things that will actually produce safety. That's also intuitive, and I'm grateful for the work that was taken to do that. When I was first running, when we were running back during George Floyd, I was still at the state level, and we were talking about defund, and we had so many white liberals come and tell us that the phrase defund the police are why white liberal Democrats lost. And a lot of them were not going to be Democrats who were going to come and they were not going to come and do anything about police violence. They were not going to come and do anything about all of the rest of the violence that black people experience. But neither here nor there. But what we know is that if you tell somebody, hey, you can have this thing or this thing, and the one thing looks better. Well, if you give them more information, they can make better decisions. Did you tell them that that thing was poison? Did you tell them that the thing that they were looking for is actually insufficient? We have to make sure that when we're looking even at polling, when we're looking at data, that we're recognizing and understanding what was the question that was asked. How are we posing it to communities? Black and brown and working class communities want to be safe. They fundamentally want to be safe. And if we can and when we do provide evidence that more police does not make them more safe, they understand it. They understand it very well. We now have data that we've been sharing out with the Black Caucus and with the rest of the Democratic Caucus that you actually don't have to fearmonger. Every election cycle, you don't have to go tough on crime. You don't have to continue to throw the most marginalized communities under the bus. And it's incumbent upon us to continue to reinforce that. Right now, more than ever, we're going to start seeing it. We're coming up on November. The immigration stories, the stories about crime and criminality, they come every election cycle. We have to stop that because we do have the solutions. We do have the data. And we do know what black communities need and want.
Congresswoman, to follow up on that, and I will note, folks, the QR code is up. And so if you've got questions, I believe you're supposed to take a photo of the QR code or open the QR code and then submit your questions via that. Although I got to be honest, we're getting some fulsome answers. And so we're going to keep vibing for now and we'll see how this goes. But send those questions in via the QR code. You mentioned the election coming up. And one thing that is, and it's unquestionably true, that there has been significant fear-mongering around these issues on the right, from Republicans, from Republican candidates, right? But there's also been a significant portion of the Democratic Party that at times, as we note, either believes it has to run by being seen as quote-unquote tough on crime, or that has concerns about, are we going too far? What should we do with this or X, Y, and Z? That, we are currently seeing the candidacy of the current vice president, and she, as a former prosecutor as well as a former state attorney general, has at times been tougher on crime, has embraced reform. What does it look like? What are the stakes of the coming 2024 election? With the caveat that we know that a lot of this work happens at state levels and local levels, right? It's not you get the right person in the presidency and everything is rainbows and butterflies. We also know we got a thing called Congress, and that is complicated one way or the other. But what are the stakes of the coming election as it relates to these conversations federally, both in terms of who's elected president, but then also in terms of control of Congress? We know the Democrats have quite an uphill battle to hold on to the Senate. And we know that the House could be a toss-up. And we also know that just a Democratic House does not mean that the wish list of Democratic or progressive priorities will get passed. And so what does that look like as we look at 2024? And I know I initially was going to ask it to the Congresswoman, but I'll ask it to all of you because I'm actually interested in hearing from, you're all smarter than me on this question. I want to know the answer to this one.
I just want to say quickly that COP cities are being built in democratically run cities all over the country, which is announced in New York City, my hometown. Folks have been mobilizing in Atlanta. And so the elections mean that we have to build power, right? The elected officials do what we demand that they do, what we have the power to make sure that they do. So whatever happens now, and this is critically important election, I don't want to take anything away from that. But if we don't continue to move forward from it and build power and continue to organize, then the demands that we think that we can advance, we won't be able to. So I just wanted to say that before the Congresswoman answered the question, because a lot of times we kind of think that that's where our civic engagement begins and ends. is next month, and it does not. It's really even more important what happens after that so that you don't end up with, thinking you won and you live in New York City with Eric Adams, but that's what I'll say.
Even more important is what we've already done. And I think that people ask me a lot. First of all, I just want to say that people ask me a lot about, well, why do you feel okay endorsing this person or that person? What do you think about this person or that person's stance on this thing or that thing? And I say that I feel more comfortable because I feel more powerful. I feel that our movements are in a more powerful position to negotiate, to move, to navigate most importantly. And I think that elected officials are recognizing that as we will power, they recognize who they call, who they answer to. And that's what we are. That's the moment that the Democrats have. We can't serve two masters. You cannot serve two masters. And for a very long time, we've attempted to, and they've been able to try to get away with it. You can't serve corporate power and also serve working people. You can't serve the money and also serve the many. And as we build our power through our movements, what we do is we hold them accountable and we call the question, whose side are you going to stand on? So when we think about what's at stake right now, I will say that I would love for the Democrats to have the gavel because I would love for the Republicans to not have the gavels. Because I've lived through them having the gavels. We've seen the type of bills that they run, what they prioritize. And we've also seen what Democrats will prioritize. And right now it's time for us to say what we want to have prioritized. I think that when we get the gavels, the one thing that I, as a progressive black woman, will be doing, as a black woman on the leftist black woman, will be doing, someone who is an abolitionist, will be pushing us to expand the realm of what we believe is possible. And so many people have done that before me and laid groundwork, which is why we already have legislation that is ready to go, that does far and beyond legislation that we've seen even in the past when we've held majorities. The People's Response Act isn't just that we want to address policing. It's we want to address societal conditions that create the poverty conditions that address crime. We want to make sure that we are addressing the public health aspect, holistically looking at policing of the criminal legal system. That bill exists because we have movement folks and we have experts within our communities that partner with their politicians to come up with solutions that we know will work for our communities. When we get those opportunities to then put those up, just because we have Democrats does not mean that we get them up, but it does mean that we have a fighting chance and we know who we're navigating and negotiating. So I think that when we decide who we want to send bills to, we send them both to the Senate, but we also send them to the president. So we want them to know that this is our priority, that it's time that we move on these things. And we send that bill not just with the pieces of paper that's on it, not just with at least 218 yay votes on it, but we also send it with millions of Americans who are backing that, have backed that, have built that, have done that work, and are ready to then say that that's the foundation and we are already looking at the next thing. So it is critically important that we help America know what it is at stake when we have the House, when we have the Senate, when we're looking at the Supreme Court and the ways in which they've been able to harness. But we have to look, again, I said that, we have to look just beyond criminal legal reform to look at all of the impediments to getting these things across the finish line. And it's not one candidate or another. It's those moneyed interests that are behind us. It's the structural racism that is embedded even within the processes. Why does the filibuster still exist? It's all of those things that we are currently and concurrently tackling, and that we are doing that now is important because that conversation on November 5th is going to heat up fast.
I think it's so crucial that all of the speakers have said we have to look just beyond who calls herself a Democrat or who calls herself a Republican and look at the actual policies. My concern is that we have a lot of black Democrats now who are not leaders on these issues and, in fact, who look and sound a lot like Republicans. So if we look at cities like New York, Washington, San Francisco, New Orleans, we have black mayors who are on the wrong side of these issues. They're running scared, and they're not helping us in terms of being safer or being freer. So again, got to look beyond party label.
As we get ready to wrap For the organizers and activists in the room, for the people who are on the front lines working on these issues, what do you say to them if, given these realities, they are discouraged? It has been a long 400-plus year fight that we see. The police are killing roughly the same number of people each year. That's obviously only one metric and one very specific metric. We are seeing things, whether it be bail reform or other things, clawed back. What do you say to someone who is reasonably discouraged by the pace of the struggle? And how do you keep them in the fight as we look forward?
I love this question. I want to shout out in the audience, we have Dr. Ron Daniels right here, IBW. And so another theme that emerged out of 2020, not just around policing, was discussion around reparations, right? Reparations, all of a sudden, the foot was on the gas for reparations. People were talking about reparations. They're going to set up a commission, a committee. People are writing city and state bills. But what folks don't understand is that there have been people like Dr. Ron Daniels working on reparations, I'm going to say 50 years. Maybe it's more than 50 years, right?
Calling him old?
I'm calling him an OG, right? I'm calling him a seasoned activist. And I know that when I get discouraged, right, and when New York City, we filed litigation, Floyd versus NYC, around stop and frisk. And it was a federal civil case, and we won. And now in New York City, it's stop and frisk. It's like crazy. It's like it was in 2013. And I can get discouraged and say, you know what? I should have just kept playing the flute. I should have stayed a music major, right? And there's nothing wrong with being a musician. I love musicians. But when I get discouraged, I look at people like Dr. Ron Daniels. I look at people like the late, great Chokwe Lumumba, whose daughter's here in the audience. I look at our elders who have carried the baton on these issues for decades, for generations. And I try to remind people what was said earlier about one of our panelists, is that the conditions we are in were legislated, right? These are policy actions that lead us to today, right? To the police killing us, to our communities not being safe, all the things that we discussed. And it's going to be policy, right, backed by power to get us out of it. But this was 400 years of policy that brought us to here. So what makes us think that because we were able to put 25 million people on the street in 1 month, which was huge, that somehow now we're going to make change in 5 years against something that was built over 400 years? So we got to look to our elders. You know, I encourage people when we leave here to ask Dr. Ron Daniels how he stays in the fight so long for reparations. But whatever he's drinking, we need to drink that level of resilient, water, juice, all of that, because this is, not to be cliche-ish, but it's not even a marathon. It's a relay race. It's a relay race. We are not the anchor leg. We hope that our children are the anchor leg. We hope that our grandchildren are the anchor leg. But the further we can get right now, we set them up to win.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. I think on an individual level, self-care is so important. And oftentimes we don't do enough of it. We are oftentimes just trying to survive in our marginalization instead of getting to a place where we thrive. So we got to put on the armor of self-care. We got to eat healthy. We got to exercise. Like, I know these are basic things, y'all, but I know how it is. You get up in the morning, think about this stuff, the issues that we're concerned about, wake us up at night so we're not getting sleep. Then we didn't eat breakfast because somebody called us to a meeting, and then we had a plan to exercise, and that didn't happen. Now all of a sudden it's 11 o'clock at night, and you just eating chips and pizza because you just so, right? And you look up, and that's went day in and day out. And I'm speaking from experience. When I was in grad school in Indiana, I could talk about that all day long. It felt like I was in Get Out. When I saw that, I was like, oh, I feel seen. Like that, going to grad school in Indiana. But it taught me a whole bunch of stuff. And one big thing it taught me is how to really deal with white people. And I think oftentimes when we are segregated, we don't really understand what it's like to go into the fire and be in that space. As the Congresswoman said, we tiptoeing in the water and we thinking we really doing something instead of diving into to where the real change is and where the work is. So we gotta take care of ourselves. And the point of mentioning Indiana is I was 60 pounds heavier then than I am now, because being in that space was about to kill me. And I was not about to be one of these people that die a slow death and talk about these illness spillovers that I talk about. So we got to put on our armor. One big one that has happened throughout this session, we got to laugh. Part of laughing is being around and being with some of the funniest people that you know. You got to smile. You got to laugh. It's really important. The other thing is realize that black people's voting is carrying a lot of the Democratic Party. Some of the analysis I've done, and that you all probably know, in certain states, we could go to Georgia, for example, roughly 50% of Democratic votes in that state are coming from black people. So we kind of got to realize what we're doing. This trope that we're not voting, it's just not true. We are actually voting on par as our population. And in fact, in 2 of the recent past 4 presidential elections, we actually voted at a higher rate than white people. Don't let people tell us that we don't vote. Now, whether or not we should vote more is a different question, right? But whether or not we vote on par is extremely important. Final point, 2 final points. First is build with organizations like the Movement for Black Lives. Build with us at the American Institutes for Research. Like, we are looking for partners. And then this is very, very important. If what something is called makes people jump ship, then they had a fragile form of allyship to begin with. And one thing I've learned, so if what something is called makes people jump ship, then they had a fragile form of allyship to begin with. And that definitely means they're not going to be advocates. Because, see, being an advocate means showing up in a space when we're not there and speaking for us. So if they're not being allies when we're there, we know what they're not going to be when we're not there. For me, I choose to be like Harriet Tubman, and I refuse to spend time on people who she would have left behind. So use your time wisely and find your tribe.
Congresswoman, you got a final word?
Yeah, I'll say it really quickly. People often ask me like what my goal is when I'm here, and there's a lot of pressure on us. Like, you got to be a workhorse. You what do you want to get done? What do you want to get done? And don't get me wrong, I would love to get many bills over to the president. I would love to do transformational work, and I plan to do it. But the number one thing that I want and plan and wish for myself is that I leave this place better than when I got it. I come as the first black woman from Pennsylvania, and as much as we can celebrate that, there's a loneliness there, but also there are trails that we still have to blaze. It should not be as hard for the next generation, even if the next generation is just next cycle, as it was for me. And it wasn't as hard as it was for the sisters who came before me, like Cori Bush, like Ayanna Pressley. It wasn't as hard for them as it was for the sisters who came before them, like Barbara Lee, the sisters who came for them, like Shirley Chisholm. So when we leave the place better than we can, you remember that your time here is as a steward, and that you give what you have to give of it, and you leave knowing that you did your best. So you don't have to stay longer than you need to, but you have to stay just as long as you must.
Now, I don't know about you all, but this has been this has been refreshing at a time when it can be difficult to see the progress on some of this. And so they're about to have the orchestra start playing me off. But before they do that, how about we have a round of applause for our panelists, for our discussion. I got like 8 questions I didn't even ask them. I got like 10 more of my own. But thank you all for sharing your expertise. Thank you for being here. And I'm sure once we take this photo, you might be able to grab 1 or 2 of them to ask a few more questions as well. So thank you all again for being here, and enjoy your CBC week, everyone.